12. Idolatry Soup. Soother was a peon working at the Megapolis Foods Inc. manufacturing, packaging, and shipping plant. He was a fairly handsome, if lean, young man with sandy hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. When he was sitting at his job along the inspection line, one got the impression that Soother's mind was hard at work on matters beyond his immediate task, for that required little thought. Soother was assigned to the soup department, where it was his job to ensure that all the labels on the soup cans were right side up. If they were upside down, the can was pulled from the assembly line and disposed of. Soother was a dynamic young man, bursting with ideas and creativity. He yearned for an opportunity to share them. He finally had his chance when Megapolis Foods Inc. was having problems selling one of its signature products, Megapolis Soup. As a result, the company's shares had seen a precipitous drop. Layoffs loomed. Worried for his own job, Soother decided he had little to lose. He walked upstairs to Mr. Megapolis's office and burst through the door. Mr. Megapolis was a tall, silver-haired man. His desk was at least the size of a 1950 Chevy. The back of his chair rose behind his head, much like a throne. Soother's palms were slick with sweat, but it was not fear that caused his hands to shake and his pulse to quicken, rather excitement. He got right to the point. He told Mr. Megapolis what the problem was and how to solve it. "It's your marketing," Soother said. "The product is solid. It's the best out there, but the public needs to be reminded of that." Mr. Megapolis was under considerable strain. The wrinkles in his forehead and around his eyes had deepened in just the past few days. He had a board of directors to answer to, as well as anxious stockholders, not to mention a lifestyle to maintain. He was ready to listen. "How do we accomplish that, Mr. Soother? My name is Soother. And, well, we need a major change. We begin with the title of the soup. We don't call it Megapolis Soup, but rather Idolatry Soup. Our slogan will go from Buy Megapolis Soup, it's good, to simply Idolatry Soup. It's better than God." "I like it," Mr. Megapolis said, the lines around his mouth turning upwards in a smile for the first time in weeks. The changes were immediate. Soon sales of Idolatry Soup were breaking all previous sales records. In short order, the entire name of the company was changed from Megapolis Foods Inc. to Idolotry Foods Inc. Soother was promoted to senior vice president and had an office next to Mr. Megapolis himself. Mr. Megapolis was profiled in business magazines. The public consumption of Idolatry Soup per capita was far beyond the government's daily recommended caloric intake. Obesity rates swelled. Sales of diet books increased, giving new life to a flagging publishing industry. At first, clothing retailers had to increase their orders of plus sizes, leading to improved sales for manufacturers, and those improvements moved all the way down the supply chain to producers such as cotton farmers who had to hire more workers and buy more machines to process more cotton. The farmers got to upgrade their beat-up pickup trucks to luxury SUVs, which helped the auto industry and all those related. When the diets and exercise promoted by the diet books grew in popularity, sales of stylish workout clothes shot up, as well as sales of running shoes, gym memberships, and exercise machines. This was followed by another wave of purchases of new, stylish, slimmed-down outfits and stylish shoes and accessories to match. Single people joined dating websites. New couples went out on dates, allowing restaurants and coffee shops to expand. Young people got more jobs as servers and baristas. In time, couples had more babies, which meant sales of baby clothes and toys, and the virtuous cycle went on and on. Everyone in the world was satisfied, satiated, and fulfilled. Except for one person. God. As one might have guessed, God was not a fan of Idolatry Soup. He was hoping that the name would just be a fad and would change in a few years as marketing trends tend to. But this did not happen. Quite the opposite, in fact. Idolotry Foods, Inc. became an institution of society. So, God decided to sue. But this presented God with an immediate challenge. There were no lawyers in heaven. He thought of asking the devil for one, but decided such a request would be inappropriate. He searched all about heaven for a lawyer, but his search was fruitless. Finally, St. Paul, who had been a tireless advocate of the church in life, volunteered to represent God. But first, he had to apply to and attend law school. With his significant connections, St. Paul was accepted into a prestigious program and, by the grace of God, graduated in only 1 year. They were ready to take on Soother. Much time had elapsed, though. By now, Soother was married to Mr. Megapoulos' daughter. Together they had 5 children: Cain, Sodom, Jezebel, Salome, and Judas. Soother was also now president and CEO of Idolotry Foods, Inc. As president and CEO, Soother had a deep bench of talented attorneys in stylish yet conservative charcoal with pinstripe suits. God was suing Soother for slander and copyright infringement, but Soother brought his own countersuit against God. He said he was representing the 4.3 million people, the best estimate from archaeologists and biblical scholars, killed by God in various floods, plagues, and tribal wars during the territorial expansion of his kingdom. There were also the various environmental protection laws that God had violated with his acts of turning the Nile into blood and burning a column of fire day and night for 40 years without the proper permits or offsetting carbon emissions. Finally, the UN was even investigating alleged war crimes attributed to God. These included charges against God for the killing of non-combatants and even genocide for various acts during the Old Testament period. A team of investigators was sent to Jericho to gather evidence. It was the trial of the millennium, albeit with a few initial technical difficulties. The court administrators would not accept "I am who I am" as a legal name. Then there was the problem that no one could actually see God, for his radiant presence blinded everyone in the courtroom. But this was sorted quickly when it was pointed out that the glare was not from God at all, but rather the various lights from TV cameras. These were adjusted, and people could then see that God was actually a very fatherly-looking fellow with deep, sad eyes, white as snow hair, and a long beard. He was less like George Burns, Morgan Freeman, or Alanis Morissette for that matter, and resembled more of a vagrant on the street picking through the trash for food. One older woman, who was a bit senile, asked him for his autograph, thinking he was Walt Whitman. The trial began. St. Paul presented his case. Commentators agreed that he did a respectable job, considering it was his first appearance in court, and that he was a legal team of one. But his reputation was called into question when opposing counsel brought up the unresolved issue of his participation in the stoning of the first Christian martyr, St. Stephen. That was 2,000 years ago, St. Paul stammered. I didn't even cast a stone. I was just holding the jackets of the guys who were doing the stone casting. Let he who is sinless hold the first jacket, or something to that effect, the judge said, a lapsed Catholic himself. St. Paul could not help himself. But Stephen and I are good friends now. We've patched things up. I did him a favor. If it weren't for me, he would not have been the first martyr. The courtroom let out a collective gasp while the TV network switched to various religious experts who began to debate whether or not John the Baptist had a more legitimate claim to being the first martyr. This led to a lively side discussion that kept viewers tuned in during the court's ensuing recess. When the trial reconvened, God was asked to take the stand. Here another technical problem arose when God was sworn in. By who or what would God swear by? The line, "So help me God," seemed quite self-serving and hardly impartial. Someone suggested that he swear by his mother's grave, but a quick explanation of his prime mover proof from St. Augustine, who had come down from heaven to sit in the gallery and watch firsthand, ruled out the notion of God having parents. Opposing counsel then asked a famous physicist to explain how our understanding of the temporality of cause and effect did not apply in the beginning of the universe, since the laws of relativity and quantum mechanics were not relevant in the early universe due to its density and energy levels. And therefore St. Augustine's argument was fundamentally flawed. Scout's honor was suggested, and thrown out before the bailiff settled on pinky swearing. The trial continued. Pundits pointed out, after just a few minutes of cross-examination, that God was not a well-coached witness. He practically admitted to the murder of millions, the flouting of environmental protection laws, and inciting crimes against humanity. St. Paul raised objections to strike God's testimony from the record, but his requests were overruled. God tried to justify himself. "You don't understand," he said. "I was a different God then. It was the Old Testament. You had to be firm. There were other gods to compete with." Opposing counsel began to inquire about God's business strategies and whether or not some of his methods violated market regulations against unfair and uncompetitive practices during his period. They went so far as to suggest that Christianity may have been breaking laws regarding monopolies in modern times. St. Paul did his best to intervene and pointed out that Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism also had large market shares, at which point Soother's attorneys brought up the specter of an investigation of collusion among members of an oligopoly. St. Paul requested a short recess and was finally able to convince his witness to plead the fifth. But they lost ground as soon as cross-examination resumed, and God characterized the Great Flood as population control. Soother's lawyers were certain they had the case wrapped up. They had run circles around the plaintiffs and offered strong closing arguments. They portrayed Soother as a good citizen, an enterprising entrepreneur, the embodiment of the American dream. He was a job creator and a family man who had become a victim of a murderous, racist, and misogynistic deity who also had a long track record of questionable environmental and business practices. The jury did not find God a sympathetic plaintiff, but once in deliberations, they were afraid to rule against God, fearing eternal punishment. The judge declared a mistrial. Soother and his lawyers left the courthouse in triumph. God, St. Paul, and St. Augustine exited, their heads held low. But God did not give up. He fell back on his former Old Testament ways. First, he sent millions of frogs to Soother's Los Angeles home, but the pollution already present in the city adversely affected them, causing them to grow extra heads and limbs. They became a waste management problem. It was Soother who teamed up with local culinary schools to collect the frogs and prepare delicacies such as frogs' legs for various homeless shelters. This resulted in excellent PR for Soother, Idolotry Foods Inc., and its subsidiaries. God tried locusts next, but Idolotry Foods Inc. was ready. Risk management experts had already predicted that God might try such a plague. The locusts were collected, sterilized, and processed into a cheap source of protein, and then converted into non-perishable porridge mix and energy biscuits to be sent to third world countries with food shortages. Next, God turned thousands of cans of idolatry soup into blood. But Soother acted quickly, sending the cans in refrigerated trucks to Red Cross blood donation centers. The Red Cross and the city of Los Angeles presented him with a medal and the keys to the city. Not to be outdone, God resorted to killing Soother's firstborn, Cain. In response, while still heartbroken, Soother had Cain cryogenically frozen, investing millions into the technology, hoping that his son might be thawed when doctors discovered a cure for God, or someone else announced that he was dead. God was discouraged. He swallowed his pride and took a trip down to hell, where he asked the devil if he could borrow a lawyer. The devil, always a fashionable spirit, met God at the elevator door wearing the season's most in-demand double-breasted business suit with tailored vest, polished loafers, no socks, they were out that year, and chromed-out cufflinks, tie pin, and watch chain. A gracious host, he invited God in for a drink. God reminded him that he was there on business purposes only. The devil, disappointed, made himself a drink anyway. As he opened his cupboard, God saw that it was stocked top to bottom with Idolotry brand products. God turned to go.
"Where are you going off to? My God, you just got here."
"Never mind. I'll see you later," God said, stepping back onto the elevator. God went back to his throne and slumped down with a sigh. He had lost the legal NPR battles. His only consolation was that he was a mortal, and Soother was not. The span of a lifetime to us, dear reader, is but a blink of an eye to an eternal being. And soon enough, Soother passed away after a full and happy life. He went straight to hell. The devil was hard-pressed for a justifiable reward for this mortal who had pleased him so much. But Satan is a creative sort. He decided to place Soother in a room with a screen playing reality television produced by Idolotry production company, while hoses pumped endless quantities of Soother's own Idolotry soup into him through a high-pressure hose. Soother's spirit was broken in a matter of hours. The taste of his own soup mixed with the rubber of the hose and the endless loops of fame-hungry contestants saying, "I'm not here to make friends," was unbearable. His jaw ached from holding the hose, his throat from the flow of scalding soup, his stomach was distended beyond recognition, and his bowels were bloody from the volume of soup flushed through his system. His ears and nose bled soup, and his eyes cried it. He repented for his sins. God, being a forgiving and loving deity, despite what the lawyers had said, was moved. He came down to hell and offered Soother a deal. Soother could start from scratch, provided he use a different slogan for his soup and company. Soother, as best as he could with the hose in his mouth, signaled that he would accept God's offer. With a snap of God's fingers, Soother was whisked out of his eternal damnation, across time and space, and found himself again along the inspection line, a young man, a peon at the beginning of his life and career, watching conveyor belts of soup cans go by in a blur. It was like waking from a bad dream. He wept, real tears this time. He had his whole life ahead of him, children to be born, a woman to fall in love with and marry, a company, an economy, and a world to save. Sure enough, as before, during Soother's time at Megapolis Foods, sales of their signature soup line were flagging. Soother, his mind only half occupied with the cognitive challenges of his position, brainstormed on solutions. Soon he had an answer to all their problems. He rushed up the stairwell, burst into Mr. Megapolis' office, and blurted out the slogan and rebrand that would save the struggling company. "Megapolis, it's a hell of a good soup." "Brilliant! That is the best slogan I have ever heard," Mr. Megapolis said before asking, "And who are you, young man?" "I'm Soother." And so began a new lifetime of success that led to prosperity, fulfillment, and peace. Jobs were plentiful. Everyone in the world was happy thanks to Soother. Soother, again, wooed and married Mr. Megapolis' daughter. Soother's new father-in-law promoted him to CEO and president. Sales grew. Hell of a Good Company, Inc. branched into new sectors including technology, electronics, engineering, pharmaceuticals, finance, entertainment, and e-commerce. Life is great, Soother thought as he reclined in his corner office, looking out over the haze of downtown LA. Even the city itself looked bathed in a layer of hell of a good soup as the brown haze thickened every day. Soother was happy. God was happy. Everything was gravy. That is, until his executive assistant buzzed a bicycle courier into his office to deliver an envelope. The athletic young woman with tattoos and sunglasses walked in wearing spandex, a body-hugging satchel, and an aerodynamic helmet. She pinched her nose as she handed the envelope over to Soother. The odor of sulfur was overpowering. Soother opened it. Another subpoena slipped out onto his desk. The typeface was Gothic and looked to have been printed in blood. The edges of the paper smoldered and were too hot to touch. Soother was being sued again, and this plaintiff had no shortage of lawyers.